minutes, and then we'll start. Great. So I can see that Heidi has started the recording. We'll go through the house rules in a second, but in the meantime, good afternoon again. Welcome to our monthly International Development and Innovation Seminar Series here at the Open University. My name is Lorena Lombardozzi, and I'm a senior lecturer here at the OU. This is the first seminar of the new academic year, and we are very delighted to host today the launch of the book of one of our lecturers, Ece Kocabıçak, who's a lecturer in the Department of Sociology here at the Open University. Before going into the details of the book launch, I just want to briefly introduce the seminar series. This is a joint seminar series based on an interdisciplinary and interfaculty center and collaboration. So it's a joint initiative with SR International Development, IKD, and Innogen. And we focus on the study of innovation and global development in a broad sense, and pretty much in line with the ethos of the Open University. So open to people, hosting people from the Global South, from different geographies, methods, and ideas. So the book is titled of Ece, The Political Economy of Patriarchy in the Global South, published with Routledge, and the series is the Studies in Gender and Economics. We have here today two great names and discussant. Unfortunately, the third one, Manali Desai from University of Cambridge, has been can't join because she had a problem with her voice. So it's pretty clear that unfortunately she could not contribute. But we have two amazing discussants. Arun Akram Lodi, Professor of Economics and International Development Studies from the Department of International Development Studies at Trent University in Canada. He is also editor-in-chief of the Canadian Journal of Development Studies and associate editor of Feminist Economics. Arun research interest is in the engendered political economy of relevant change, on economics dimension of gender relations, and political ecology of sustainable rural livelihoods in low-income and middle-income countries. And then we have Sanjari Roy, who is a senior lecturer in development economics at the Department of International Development at King's College London, UK. Sanjari's work focuses on various types of constraints faced by low-income countries in the process of poverty alleviation and economic development. Some of the themes of her research include the role of gender constraints in perpetuating poverty, inheritance rights, public service delivery, and psychological constraints. As we said, Ece will introduce the book for 5-7 minutes, then we will have the interventions of the two discussants, and then we will open the floor for Q&A. As you know, the event is being recorded and will be available for playback to be watched again. And will be posted on the website. So for those who want to be futures and remain anonymous, you can type your questions in the chat box, or otherwise raise your hands in the reactions button, and we will slowly trying to include everyone and happy to have their questions so that we can have an inclusive discussion. So without further ado, I'm just very excited because in a way I work also on the political economy of gender and patriarchy. So I'm really excited to hear more about this amazing book. So I leave the floor to Ece to introduce to us the contribution of and the novelty of the book, and then we'll have the discussion, and then a little bit of rebuttal, and then we will have the Q&A. So we have a very dense schedule, so I won't speak further, and I'll pass the floor to Ece. Thank you.
First of all, I would like to thank Lorena and Heidi for organizing this event. And thank you very much for others participating in my book launch today. Please allow me to welcome Turkish speaking participants. Zaman ayırdığınız ve bugün burada olduğunuz için çok teşekkür ederim. So I'm going to share my slides. I think you can see my slides now. I have been involved in feminist politics in 4 countries, in 3 continents for more than 20 years. And in light of my experience, I propose that the causes and consequences of gendered oppression and inequality are not limited to the micro or meso level analysis. In order to develop effective feminist strategies, it's important to ask big questions, leading to the macro level analysis. With this book, my aim is to develop those questions and contribute to their answers. The first question is, what role gender plays in shaping socio-economic transformation? As Bowlby and Shire stress, the macro-level political economy has too often been theorized as an ungendered process. I argue that this problem gives strength to capitalism-based reductionism or cultural essentialism within the current scholarship of sociology, international development, social policy, and gender studies. For example, not only the neoclassical, but also the classical and Marxist accounts of development share the same underlying assumption that the dynamics of capitalism are the only determinants of social change. When the key features of capitalism do not explain the extended variation of socio-economic development, the cultural and religious settings of non-Western societies are frequently portrayed as the barrier to development. While this, I would argue, essentialist approach decreases the causes and consequences of gendered oppression and inequality to the cultural and religious settings, capitalism-based reductionism tends to reduce the relationship between gender and development, either to the gendered outcomes of, like how capitalist development affects women differently to men, or the gendered prerequisites for capitalism, like ways in which capitalism requires gendered hierarchy and women's unpaid domestic labor. This book aims to go beyond these limitations and proposes that not only class, but also gender, race, ethnicity, or caste-based dispossession and labor exploitation are significant in diversifying the trajectories of socioeconomic transformation, including capital accumulation strategies, state formation, civil society, and violence. What causes gendered oppression and inequality? I provide a critical assessment of the social reproduction approach, which I argue tends to reduce the causes of uneven gender relations to the dynamics of capitalism, and at the same time appears to naturalize gender-based division of labor. While invaluable in conceptualizing the equal significance of gender, class, and ethnicity-based inequality regimes, I suggest that gender regime scholarship does not pay enough attention to the patriarchal labor exploitation in non-market or market-oriented production. This in turn leads to the dismissal of varieties of patriarchy in the global south. As well as assessing the limitations of existing methodologies, this book proposes that the historical materialist methodology and ontology is significant and necessary to overcome various oppressions and inequalities. Yet the influence of mechanical materialism, especially the Althusserian-based superstructure approach, needs to be removed from our theoretical trajectories. In order to do so, I explore the potential contribution of Hegelian Marxism to feminist thought by developing the concepts of collective subject, self-consciousness, mediation, and totality, as well as the notion of the unity of the material and the social for feminist analysis. Another central question that emerges here is, what does the Western-centric social theory conceal in our geographies? The answer to this question heavily depends on the chosen theoretical framework. Drawing on historical materialism, this book suggests that not only capitalists, but also patriarchal and racist collective subjects are significant for social change. And at the same time, those collective subjects in the global south are comprised of different groups to the global north. Furthermore, the totality that we all live in is not necessarily determined by the lack of capitalism or distorted versions of capitalism. The mediating categories of patriarchal or racist systems in the global south can be more influential than the global north. As a result, these processes give rise to varieties of patriarchies and racisms dissimilar to the global north. Here, in this map, I have addressed the geopolitics of patriarchal transformation in Turkey. Drawing on gender regimes scholarship, I differentiate the domestic form of patriarchy from the public form, as well as identifying two different forms of domestic patriarchy. In pre-modern domestic patriarchy, women's exclusion from agricultural land ownership, in conjunction with the dominance of small land ownership, sustains the patriarchal exploitation of labor in agriculture. In modern domestic patriarchy, women's exclusion from paid employment, along with dispossession and increasing wage dependency, maintains the patriarchal relations of labor within the home. My analysis indicates that while agrarian and semi-agrarian cities are shaped by the predominance of pre-modern and modern domestic patriarchies, non-agrarian cities comprise modern domestic and neoliberal public patriarchies. In those agrarian and semi-agrarian cities, gender-based exclusionary strategies confine the majority of women's labor to rural and urban household production. Alongside the domestic patriarchal form, neoliberal public patriarchy is emerging in non-agrarian cities, sustaining women's double burden of paid and unpaid labor. The structure of patriarchal transformation indicates a combined development of pre-modern and modern and development of neoliberal patriarchies in Turkey. While women living in different spaces are divided, it's important to note that women can also travel between varieties of patriarchy and experience different forms in their lifetime. For example, upon marrying a male breadwinner, a female peasant may leave agriculture and migrate to work as a full-time homemaker. If her husband's limited income pushes her to join the labor market, then this rural migrant woman becomes a female wage worker. Again, depending on her working condition and husband's income, a female wage worker might choose to work as a full-time homemaker. However, there are not only divisions across space, but also changes over time, which mean variations in the experiences of different groups of women. My analysis indicates that ethnicity and religion-based oppression diversifies the experiences of Kurdish and Alevi women, but at the same time converges their experience with women with the dominant ethnicity and religion. Meanwhile, class-based oppression and exploitation change women's experiences of patriarchy, including Alevi and Kurdish women. Sunni or Alevi, as well as Turkish or Kurdish, women who can access advanced education are more likely to experience neoliberal public patriarchy, whereas others live under the conditions of pre-modern and modern domestic patriarchy. Focusing on the case of Turkey, my discussion on the political economy of patriarchy ends with a brief assessment of the dynamics which can challenge the hegemony of domestic patriarchy in the country. Firstly, the divisions amongst women on the grounds of patriarchy need addressing in order to develop effective feminist strategies. The success of the feminist movement in organizing women with different backgrounds against domestic violence reveals the capacity of the movement to align women's separate agendas and to thereby initiate a shift within the current forms of patriarchy. The assumption that capitalist transformation determines the forms and degrees of gender inequality prevents the development of effective feminist strategies in many ways. For instance, one view arising from this assumption predicts that sooner or later capitalist development will diminish the material base of patriarchy in agriculture and pull women into the labor force. A second view suggests that if not capitalism, it's Islamic culture and religion sustaining the predominance of gender-based exclusionary strategies. Both approaches effectively obscure the role of the patriarchal political subject. It's important to consider the ways in which the patriarchal collective subject maintains its political power by utilizing the racist and capitalist state agendas, as well as the de-democratization process. As the current racist and capitalist state agendas in Turkey are deeply entangled with male domination, biological essentialist accounts of gender, heteronormative understanding of family, and de-democratization, it's important to establish long-term strategic alliances with the working class, LGBTQ+, and anti-racist social movements. I would like to, here with this presentation, I would like to give a brief summary of the book. And I'm hoping that I can contribute to the discussions after discussants' presentations, and I can talk a bit more during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ece. Very enlightening. And I hope that, there will be definitely more time to discuss further details, the content of the book. Now we pass the floor to Arun, who will have 15 minutes to discuss the book, and then we'll follow by Sanjari. Thank you, Arun.
Thank you very much, Lorena. And again, my thanks to Heidi for organizing this particular seminar. But most of all, of course, congratulations to Ece on the publication of The Political Economy of Patriarchy in the Global South. I mean, I think everyone, I'm sure everyone joins me in congratulating her on this publication. Now, for some of us of a certain age, it might seem as if what this book is about is in some ways quite old-fashioned. After all, it engages with debates within political economy that resurrected themselves within contemporary social theory in the 1970s, and that's 50 years ago. But old-fashioned does not mean out of fashion. And I would argue that, as Ece notes at the outset of the book, given the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the workloads of women around the world, understanding the ways by which gender regimes shape trajectories of capitalist development, state formation, and the actions of civil society actors remains critical to the project of a just socioeconomic transition. Now, at its core, Ece is seeking to answer a question that is easy to frame, but profoundly difficult to answer. And that is, what is the relationship between patriarchy and capitalism? This is a question that I myself have been trying to understand for more than 40 years, which I hate to say, but we'll just leave it at that. Now, clearly, patriarchy predates capitalism. But if that is the case, is patriarchy the same under capitalism as it was under older modes of production, or is it different? Now, this is an important question because, as Alexandra Kollontai recognized more than a century ago, it has critical implications for the struggle for a post-capitalist future. And here my own thinking has been influenced by two people in particular: the late Michel Pujol, who was my friend and also my teacher, as well as my former colleague Bridget O'Loughlin, from whom I've learned so much. O'Loughlin in particular argues that the emergence of capitalism has reconfigured the operation of patriarchy so that it operates within, but not necessarily fully consistently with, prevailing relations of production. And one way of thinking about this is then that capitalism shapes, but is also shaped by patriarchal relations. And I find that a very easy way of thinking about the interrelationship. Now, I think that Ece's book contributes to this understanding with her introduction of the concept of patriarchal labor exploitation. As I understand it, she argues that, quote, the exploitation of labor is purely a social relationship in which the dominating sections of society appropriate the surplus produced by the subordinated sections, unquote. And in this, again, quote, gendered oppression and inequality derive from the relations of labor exploitation, thereby establishing the patriarchal system of exploitation. And in this, quote, appropriators force certain tasks on producers by sustaining the binary sex-gender system and uneven gender relations within society, unquote. And this is then enforced through inequalities of violence. So in Ece's conceptualization, patriarchal labor exploitation is a mechanism of surplus extraction. And then in the book, she then explores this through the case of Turkey, using this concept of patriarchal labor exploitation. And in particular, the spatial, temporal, and geographic variations of patriarchy that are experienced under capitalist relations of production in the Turkish case. Now, what I'd like to stress is that here I'm of no doubt whatsoever that patriarchal labor exploitation as a mode of surplus extraction is real, and it's a very useful concept to have brought out. Now, I don't come to this conclusion through the macro level of analysis that Ece uses in her book, through the study of a particular country such as Turkey, its historical and contemporary experience. I come to this conclusion on the basis of the micro, on the basis of fieldwork, the fieldwork that I've done over the last 40 years. For those of you who may know my work, I work within the terrain of what we broadly call the agrarian question, the terms and conditions by which capitalism transforms small-scale peasant agriculture. And Henry Bernstein has sort of broken down the agrarian question into these four questions of political economy, which now seems to be the case. Most students of development studies learn in lecture number 1 or 2 if they're getting a political economy approach. And these four questions basically are: who owns what, who does what, who gets what, and what do they do with it? But these questions, these are profoundly gendered questions. Who owns what points to the fact that there are very significant gender-based differences as well as class-based differences in patterns of asset ownership in contemporary societies. Who does what points to the fact that there are very strong gender-based differences in work patterns as well as waged work patterns in contemporary societies. Who gets what is a profoundly gendered question given the extent to which women are predominantly responsible for unpaid care and domestic work, which of course is not remunerated, but beyond that, the extent to which in many developing country settings, women act as contributing family labor and receive receipts from that work, which are far less than the prevailing wage rate. And what do they do with it is also a profoundly gendered question, because our micro level surveys always tell us that women spend money in different ways than men spend money, even under capitalist relations of exploitation. So it seems to me that agrarian political economy has to adopt a gendered perspective in thinking about these four micro level questions. And in particular, I would point to fieldwork that I conducted in rural Malawi, Tanzania, and Uganda in 2017, where I came across what for me was quite a remarkable social process. Now, across the 3 countries of the region where I was doing fieldwork, I was working with small-scale farming households in which polygamy was a very common practice. And men always said they owned land, even though it was commonly held, but they said they owned it. And men commonly had multiple wives. Now, the social norm was that after performing their socially necessary unpaid care and domestic work, multiple wives were expected to work upon the plots of land that their sole husband managed, fully completing any tasks that were required of them before they could work on the plots of land which they were responsible for managing. Commonly, the demands of unpaid care and domestic work and working on their husband's plots meant that wives did not have enough time to work on their own plots of land, a classic case of time poverty. Men's plots produced cash crops, men controlled the cash receipts received from those crops, and there was no formal expectation of sharing or pooling cash receipts, although there was a practice of providing some money from men for household expenses. Women's plots, on the other hand, produced staple food crops to meet the food security needs of the household. Now, in that kind of a setting, I particularly remember a conversation that I had with a group of men who were members of a cooperative in Western Tanzania. I asked these men, 14 of them sitting in front of me, what did they do with their cash receipts from their crops? And they were very explicit about this. They tried to save some of their cash so that they could invest in marrying again, in acquiring another wife. So I asked, why do you do this? They answered that they did this so that they would have more labor to work on their plots of land, increasing the cash receipts that their land generated, and in so doing, accruing more cash income. In other words, for these men, marriage enabled accumulation. And while this accumulation would be statistically credited to the household as a whole, the reality was this was men's accumulation on the basis of women's labor. Marriage was thus a way of mobilizing labor into production for the purpose of extracting surplus. This is what, in my understanding, Ece calls patriarchal labor exploitation. And of course, it is shaped by the fact that women do not control adequate quantities of land independent of their husbands and become dependent upon them as a result. Moreover, the cisgender heterosexual family has the highest level of complexity in mediating patriarchal labor exploitation and household production in the areas where I work, which is precisely what Ece suggests, I think, in her book. Now, as I understand it, Ece then takes the concept further, the concept of patriarchal labor exploitation further into the realm of unpaid care and domestic work. And here, I must say, I'm less comfortable with the concept of exploitation. I've been doing this for a long time. I have a great deal of difficulty using that particular phrase. And this is because, to me, defining what is meant by surplus faces difficulties when looking at unpaid care and domestic work. And so in my own work, I find appropriation to be a less loaded conceptual tool to understand unpaid care and domestic work. But that's, this is a trifling nuance which we can amiably discuss between ourselves at length going forward. I think the key point here, which I think really flows from Ece's work in this book, is that too many social theorists, and I include myself here, and I mean too many social theorists here and now in 2022, have absorbed and take for granted 19th century notions of romantic love as the underpinning social bond of marriage. But in reality, for the majority of the planets of population, it seems to me, and across most of our planet's history, marriage has been a form of labor regime, a way of mobilizing labor for the purpose of extracting surplus. My own fieldwork demonstrates this to be the case, and I think Ece's work using patriarchal labor exploitation in the political economy of patriarchy in the global south further reinforces the point. I think if Ece's book's audience takes away this idea of patriarchal labor exploitation and conceptually uses it, runs with it, if you like, then Ece will have done social theory a great service. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Arnon, for kind of emphasizing the fact that this is a multi-layered analysis, and in the agrarian questions, most of these questions have been for someone who did their PhD at SOAS pretty much clear. But it's good that Ece has been able to complexify and bring it one level more and further questions. So now I give the floor to Sanjari. And you'll have 15 minutes. So, I mean, Arun has been perfectly generous with you because possibly you have 2 minutes more or more time for Q&A. All right.
Thanks. Thanks, Lorena. I probably will not take 15 minutes, but I'll try to keep this short because we want Ece to have as much of the floor and as much of the discussion. But thank you very much to Lorena and Heidi for smoothness and seamless organization of this, and congratulations to Ece on a very interesting, I think, piece of work that to me really shone a lot of interesting light on the economic development process and the gender struggles within the context of Turkey. So it was definitely a space where I learned quite a lot of interesting new things that to some ways do speak to my own research as well. So I'm looking forward to this discussion myself. Following after Harun is a tough ask because he's been so eloquently clear about, how Ece's work tries to push the boundaries, and there's really a lot to sort of absorb from what Harun spoke to as well. And he summarized, Ece's work also very, very effectively. So I thought I would sort of, speak to a few themes where I feel that maybe the conversation as far as social reproduction and the interrelationship between patriarchy and capitalism can move to and is already moving to. So I probably want to sort of think a little bit into the future and see how Ece's work connects to some of these themes, and in the process maybe talk about a few ideas that I've been exploring myself. So the first thing I wanted to sort of, say is that the relationship between patriarchy and capitalistic production, and, how we think about these two systems sort of, moving forward and informing each other. As a mainstream economist, I'm very much sort of, excited to see that obviously my own work, I'm biased, but my own work definitely speaks to these themes. But also within the mainstream economics sort of, discipline, there has been a lot of interesting work that is actually shining light on the gendered aspect of economic transformation, as well as the implications of that on outcomes of men and women and how they perpetuate, and how can we think about also sort of bringing economic policy in, how can we think about understanding those in greater depth that therefore then informs policy design, right? Often as economists, we tend to sort of, put on our policy hat to see how our research, our theoretical understandings, our empirical findings can therefore then be channelized into policy to effect change going forward. In that context, so for example, I remember one of the foremost female economists at this point in time, Rohini Pandey, mentioning in one of her keynote speeches recently that early economics, especially early economic theory, often tended to ignore leisure of women. Right. So when we are thinking about the economic modeling of production, of social production, we are thinking about leisure and work, right? But at some level, maybe leisure of women specifically tends to get neglected or used to be neglected, especially if you think about not just through the duration of the pandemic, but in survey after survey across different countries, we have seen that women's contribution to housework and domestic work far exceeds that of men. And this might be a larger divergence in the context of maybe some developing countries, but this is still a non-trivial difference between men's contribution to housework and women's contribution to housework, even in advanced nations, right? So the question is, where is that additional time coming from? After all of us have 24 hours. So clearly that is coming out of what is defined sometimes, probably simplistically in economic theory, as leisure. Right. So that's something I felt that Ece's sort of, overall thematic framework spoke to, and also something that Harun directly sort of, commented upon. It would be one way of sort of thinking and structuring our understanding around what Ece refers to as patriarchal labor exploitation or appropriation. And I think I agree with Harun in this context that this is more about sort of, discounting certain kinds of, involvement that in the production process that actually has ramifications in terms of economic production, but is not counted, right? So, for example, I want to sort of link this discussion to the revived. I mean, I know, 30, 40 years ago, this was a very live debate, but there is a revival of a discussion around, for example, wages for housework. So, for example, my colleague at King's, Prabha Kotiswaran, she has been sort of at the forefront of this discussion in the Indian context, along with my other good friend, Ashwini Deshpande from Ashoka University. And I think the whole idea, there is a lot of debate about, whether this actually makes sense and whether policy should actually throw its weight behind this. And there was discussion around the pandemic, for example, in India, when different state governments in India were sort of crediting a small sum of money in women's bank accounts, right? Now, whether this is compensation for their, unpaid domestic work, or whether this is sort of, to affect differentially consumption patterns within the family, that is all, up for discussion. But the whole idea, if we take a step back and think about how, for example, in a completely specialized household where the husband is engaged in what is called economic production and the wife, their partner, is engaged in social production, not just childcare, but also, let's say, domestic chores, taking care of, elderly family members, making sure the household is running on time. If we were to be able to put a value, okay, to that contribution, then the question in one's mind would be, well, then in terms of the economic production function, right, a lot of this input, which is invisible to some extent, should be accounted for, right? And therefore, if we think about the wages that the husband is earning from their, involvement in the labor market, how much of that is actually coming from the fact that their time is freed up because their wife is doing the cooking and the washing and the organization and the, child minding and everything, right? So it's a very complex way of sort of, thinking about this. It's not easy. There is no, one shot silver bullet as to, oh, this is the amount and this is how. So it's very layered and nuanced. But I think we, as sort of, as researchers, as scholars who are genuinely invested in understanding the answers to these questions, or at least debating and discussing these questions, it's very important to sort of, ask these questions, because at some level, we might be almost taking for granted that, okay, whatever is, being, whatever labor effort is being provided in the labor market is rewarded, but we are sort of not being able to systematically, formally impute a value to the invisible labor, which is very gendered, right? And this is, I think, the point that Ece is making in her book as well, which is very gendered in terms of how that kind of labor stacks up. And to be honest, if you think about it, and a lot of economists have talked about this as well. For example, if we were able to put an appropriate value to this kind of, invisible work, let's call that, an imputed value, then, for example, GDP calculations might be very different, right? So current GDP calculations do not take into account a lot of this invisible work. And when I'm putting on my economist hat, when I'm putting on my policy hat, we are therefore linking this challenge to, for example, labor force participation of women, right? The fact that they are not physically involved in what, as economists, we call labor force participation, because they're not involved in paid work, doesn't mean that they are not contributing to the economic production and GDP calculations. It's just that we haven't devised sophisticated enough mechanism and structure to be able to correctly value this, which has consensus across different economic spectrums, right? So that is one point I wanted to sort of, make and sort of link it to this this revived debate about wages for housework that I think the broader context within which Ece situates her book, this is very relevant, but it's kind of sort of, linking it to other work that, would be also relevant here. So that's my first point. The second point I wanted to sort of talk about, again, sort of opening up the discussion a little bit, is that in her book, Ece talks about norms about gender roles. Again, kind of speaks to exactly what I was saying here, that, you know, if as a girl, I'm conditioned to grow up to be, while growing up, to think of the home as being my responsibility. And as a boy, I'm conditioned to think of the home as not being my responsibility, but, you know, outside, the outside work. So if we think about sort of, you know, breadwinner norms or social norms around gender roles, that plays a huge role in terms of sort of, you know, setting the stage and feeding into the structures that we currently see, which both Ece and Harun in their discussion talked about, right? I wanted to kind of bring in a slightly different lens which links to this, which is to think about social networks. Right. And this links a little bit to my own work. And I wonder, you know, how this would be in the Turkey context. But, you know, broadly speaking, you know, in many contexts, and for example, definitely in India, where a lot of my own work, and there's been new work that is emerging in the context of India, to shed light on the fact that men's networks and women's networks are very different. There are gendered structures that sort of organically feed into the kind of networks men and women select into, right? And this may have independently an impact in terms of perpetuating some of the social norms around gender roles, as well as constraining women's efforts to probably increase their participation in the labor market as defined conventionally. And what I mean by that is, for example, in very recent work that we've been doing in urban India, we are finding that women's networks tend to be smaller, tend to be more homebound, and tend to be more family oriented. And this is being reflected in more recent work coming out of the World Bank, focusing on rural women as well. So if you think about patriarchal systems where women typically follow patriarchality, right? So the woman marries and goes and lives with her husband and her in-laws family. Especially if I think about the Indian context, there is a lot of work that has shown that there are economic benefits for marrying your girl to a village which is pretty far away, partly because of insurance reasons, especially if you are strongly sort of, you know, linked to agriculture as your livelihood, okay? But that would mean that the girl is sort of severing her links from her natal village and having to set up new links, which are always challenging, you know, to do. But there are strong social norms and limitations to whom you can interact with. So, for example, in a recent paper that some colleagues from the World Bank has looked at, they have found that on average, a rural woman in Uttar Pradesh, in the northern part of the country, they report having their mother-in-law or their sister-in-law as a key node in their social network. Beyond that, they seem to report one additional friend on average who's potentially going to be their neighbor, right? So this homebound nature of women's social networks, family-centric nature in terms of their networks, might also mean that there is kind of pushback to opening up labor opportunities for women, right? And if I'm not able to collaborate or integrate or interact with other women, right, who are beyond my immediate cycle, the collective action, the collective force of trying to sort of, you know, sort of mold or shape the social norms around female work might be challenging. Right? So you are unable to use external stimuli because your networks are very much down to specifically those contexts which actually end up restraining you to begin with, right? One other interesting aspect we are finding, which seems to be an interesting distinction between the urban context and the rural context, at least in India, is that if you think about a lot of rural-urban migration for women, it typically happens for marriage. This is exactly what Harun was referring to a little while ago, right? That, you are going to, you're probably going to move to an urban center, you're moving there with your husband, you might end up working in the informal sector or some kind of sort of precarious work. But again, you are losing whatever, social networks you had back in your family, even back in your, village, even if it was around your, in-laws family. And it could be that networks change again, right? In terms of their isolation. So for example, one very interesting descriptive statistics we are finding in urban Delhi is that a lot of women seem to report in our survey having male family members in their network. So this could be like a brother-in-law who has followed them to, to the urban context as well. And that might mean that instances that, that might help women to break the barriers to enter the labor market in terms of productive wage work might be compromised, because your network itself is probably going to constrain you in terms of enforcing the social norms that are rather conservative in terms of female work going forward, right? So I wanted to sort of bring those two aspects, the aspect of unaccounted for female work, which is invisible, and also the role of social norms that and social networks, specific nature of social networks that might contribute to these differences that we are observing between men and women's outcomes, especially in terms of economic. I think I went over. I'll stop there. Thank you.
No, perfect. I mean, thank you, Sanjari. I think the two contributions of the discussion are very complementary, because one looks more of the nitty-gritty political economy of stratification and labor exploitation, and one more of the institutional, interrelated institutional constraints and norms. So, Ece, I think you might want to have like a couple of minutes just to have immediate reaction to those two interventions,
so
and then we'll open the floor for Q&A. Yeah, great.
Thank you, because these are very important points, and I don't want to forget my engagement, my ideas about it. I think it's very important that, thank you so much for Harun and Sanjari, first of all, for their contribution to the discussion. Like Harun has mentioned, it's really important to ask the question of what's the relationship between patriarchy and capitalism, as well as racism. And I totally agree with Harun's understanding and the way he theorizes the relationship that shaped and also shaped by patriarchy, reconfigured to operation of patriarchy, but also shaped by patriarchy. Also, Sylvia Wolby, Nancy Fulp, they also provide how there is a mutually shaping relationship between patriarchy and capitalism or other systems as well. With this book, I also wanted to go further a little bit. Like, okay, they are mutually shaping each other, but how? When we ask this question of how, the answer is, since the domestic labor debate, the answer is because women's unpaid domestic labor supports capitalist wage structure and reproduction of workers. However, this doesn't mean this explanation is correct, but at the same time, it does more. Capitalism, patriarchy shapes capitalism also in different ways, which are not necessarily limited to ideology level or social norms level. So, and this mechanism is also context dependent. So in one geography, it can shape in different ways, but in different geography, it can shape in different ways. So in order to analyze this diversity, and in order to elaborate on different ways, I think, like Harun has mentioned, agriculture provides a massive resource to us. And at the same time, I try to focus on the concept of mediation, the ways in which cisgender heterosexual family mediates the relations of labor exploitation, and how these ways are different, and how the complexity of mediation is very important. The more complex the mediation is, the role of patriarchy, or vice versa, capitalism, gets more important in social change. So in the book, this was a discussion in the book, but in chapter 8, I talk a little bit about, is it possible to take the concept of overdetermination out of the Althusserian structure and redefine that concept on the grounds of Hegelian Marxism and the concept of mediation. Like, I think this is necessary in order to produce, in order to develop effective social policy. I will give the example of agriculture again. The Bernstein's questions are very important, and I think I find it very important that Marxist agrarian political economics diversify, analyze the different trajectories of patriarchal change. So the different, the American path, the French path, the Russian path, which is a very, very enriching discussion actually, as well as Turkish agrarian political economics. But it is not just they don't see gender. They don't see gender also at a macro level concept, changing the social, socio-economic development. If they did, I believe, they would realize that there is a particular path of agrarian change dominated by the pre-modern domestic patriarchy that I call it the patriarchal path of agrarian change. And this change does not only shape rural transformation, but it has an impact on urban transformation as well. It shapes the proletarianization process, the movement of labor from agriculture to non-agricultural sectors. It shapes state formation, and that state shapes more or less everything, I would say. And because they don't see this difference, I mean, as well as micro, we also need macro level analysis. And then when they don't see these differences, social policy doesn't work for everyone. I will give two examples here. One is the World Bank's social policy. So since the 2000s, World Bank trying to transform gender inequality in rural areas. Thus, they try to close the gap in terms of expand rural women's access to land, finance, link women to agricultural food chains, improve women's access to training and information. And the Turkish state, as well as Indian state, they follow these policies. Like one might, despite I argue that Turkish state is deeply patriarchal, but they follow these policies. But the result is, because they don't acknowledge these patriarchal relations, these policies does actually lock women in agricultural unpaid work, rather than helping women, if they like to, helping women to access education, paid employment, or different. So this social policy could be valid for some regions in the world, and according to my early assessment, it can work. For example, in East Asia, Pacific, Latin America, Caribbean, Southeast, and Western Africa. But South Asia, Middle East and North Africa, and Middle and Eastern Africa, in my hypothesis, marked by the patriarchal path of agrarian change, they require different policies. And this policy doesn't exist. Another example of policy is women's access to paid employment. Today, we are more or less focused on a single policy setting, which focuses on the public provisioning of care in urban areas, which is, I argue that, and I try to provide evidence in the book that this policy is, the impact of this policy is limited to relatively high level of educated women, and it doesn't help women at lower level of education. It doesn't help, rural women has nothing to do with this policy, for example. So this is another policy that we are all following globally, and they don't work. Therefore, it is important to accept the differences of patriarchal relations of labor in rural household as well as urban household. And this is a very important question, whether or not what is happening in rural household can be called an exploitation, but the urban households draw on unpaid care is maybe it should be appropriation. I think it's a new question, and I think we need to think as well. I think we need to have a new definition of what accumulation is. And in classical Marxist theory, there is one form of accumulation, and it doesn't allow you to acknowledge different forms of accumulation. But in feminist theory, I think feminist theory is very rich in terms of accepting different forms of accumulation. Like, I think she's also here. I remember Anne Ferguson's work on social movements, Occupy movement, and how in Occupy movement, women shouldered more work than men, and how this created some sort of benefit for men. She doesn't call it accumulation, but whether we need to go back to concept of accumulation and redefine it, or like other feminists do, they totally drop the concept because Marxists don't allow them to play with the concept, in my opinion. It's a very rigid understanding. And the wages for housewives and invisibility of women's domestic work in urban areas, care work. I don't think that women's work is invisible. And I would say that Turkish state deliberately utilize relatively less educated women's domestic labor to sustain its family-based social care system. It's a very deliberate process. And without those women's unpaid labor, they know that they don't have any kind of social care system. Does British state do differently than Turkish state? I don't think so. When we look at the COVID policies, we were all sent back home. If I'm sick, if I have a COVID, go at home and self-isolate at home. Who is going to care me at home? They all knew, I think, that women's labor is visible. We might calculate, we might make it more, of course, it's very useful to make it visible, to add it into GDP, calculate GDP in different ways. But my concern here is, again, are we locking women into a position where she has to work without any kind of payment? And she doesn't have, more importantly, she doesn't have option to choose something else. And I think this is happening, and that's why I call that form as a particular form of patriarchy, where women are excluded from paid employment, which is the dominant form in Turkey and very important for us. And I think in India, women's access to paid employment, female labor force participation, I mean, forget about being stabilized, it's decreasing. I mean, these are very alarming sounds for us, I think. And yes, I'm fine now. Thank you so much for your contribution.
Thank you, Ece, for slightly and comprehensively points. We now open the floor. I guess we will can open further discussion with the discussants, but we have 30 minutes left. So for the sake of time, we want to open the floor for Q&A. And so to the audience, please either raise your hands or type your question in the chat box. We will be more than happy to collect a first round of questions and let Ece and the co-discussant reply. There's been a lot of points raised, huge points, and yeah, concept of accumulation, for instance. So I will just give the floor to Anne Ferguson. Thank you for joining us. Please unmute yourself, or I think Heidi will unmute you. Yeah, I think we can start with you, Anne.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much for inviting me to come to this book launch. And thank you, Ece, for a really interesting and I think important new theoretical intervention into feminist theory about the connection between patriarchy and capitalism. And I found the book very illuminating. I'm a philosopher by trade, so but I have done some work in sociology and economics because all of us feminist theorists really do need to be interdisciplinary. And so I just have a few questions to throw out. I think one question I would like to sort of start with is, what does Hegelian Marxism, what does that perspective add to what the other commentators have been saying? I think it in part touches on the whole question of exploitation you know, in patriarchy as opposed to capitalism, and how that connects to accumulation, and what that kind of accumulation is, and how that connects to creating collective subjects, which is, I think, what you talk about in your last chapter. And it does seem to me that some of the questions that have been raised about whether that exploitation is just analogous to capitalist exploitation, that somehow men, you know, in the family and in the workforce appropriate or force certain, this is a quote from you, are appropriators who force certain tasks on producers, that is women, by sustaining the binary sex gender system and uneven gender relations within society, and sort of analogous to capitalists and workers, or whether there's something else going on. And you do a good, you do in your book make distinctions between domestic, pre-modern and modern domestic patriarchy and public patriarchy in terms of how this process works. But you know, there is a control issue here that it seems important, that isn't simply accumulation or appropriation. Really, men are forcing women to do certain kinds of work, the undesirable and low status work, the unpaid work, the entrapping work of childcare. And yes, they do less of the overall work than women, and they're sort of appropriating more surplus in some way that needs to be explained what that surplus is. But the control aspect is important. And I think the motivation question then that makes men collective subjects and somehow keeps, that is self-conscious collective subjects, and women less likely to be self-conscious collective subjects is important. That is, and in my own work, I think what needs to be really more developed here is the role of children and the role of women's social and emotional relation to children. That actually, if the family is a mediating force here in the patriarchal bargain that women are making with fathers, they're allowing themselves to be exploited by men if men will provide some family support to children. So there's this vector of divorce, single motherhood. These are negative material motivators for women. And also, as you point out, in the context of women working in the home and only having kin networks with which to develop collective subjectivity, they don't have peer relations outside the family, which can allow them to find a way to understand and become self-conscious of this as exploitation and as, you know, possibly challengeable because of their interest in children and their interest in supporting and making sure that children are supported. Hence, Haron's example of the mothers who are working extra time in their plots to sustain the family, which are the children and their children, and especially in a non-monogamous family, you know, they are having to make sure their children, in a whole bunch of children, are being sustained. And it does seem that this sex-effective economy is important to, which is what I talk about it as, where you're basically exchanging sexual satisfaction, physical affection, and care, and not only with women with men, but women with children, and women are doing way more of the relation to and support of these needs of children than men, because men, in fact, in their gender division of labor, are less socially bonded with them and taught to be less socially bonded with them than women. So it does seem to me that when you're thinking about policy and when you're thinking about what's necessary to create collective subjectivity of women, that's when you're going to the political policy implications, you need to, there needs to be more development of this whole, if you want, triadic relationship in the family, and the disparate relations, gender relations that are there between men and women, and men, women, and children. I don't know. That's a big question, but.
Yes, thank you very much. And Ferguson, I think, yes, that opens up a very big question that we might want to answer in a few seconds. I just want to say, don't be scared. I know that in the audience, because this is an international interdisciplinary seminar series, we might have people attending that are not who are not experts in gender and political economy of gender and patriarchy, but please don't feel intimidated. And I think we're also happy to the speakers and discussants to reply to important question that might not be from a gender point of view and can be illuminating anyway. If not, anyone is, I will then add my own little question, and is related to the concept of accumulation, because like in the, and it relates to Arun's question. Speaking of my own research and my own experience in a post-Soviet states, accumulation has been a very important criteria and to create taxonomy about social stratification. And then obviously then patriarchy and regime of patriarchy are shaped and shape those patterns and stratifications in a very material sense. So I would be very interested in understanding how in a low-income context where civil society or like, movements and campaigns are not that visible, especially in rural areas where, the polity, I mean, maybe so, speaking for the Central Asian regions where you have democracies that are less than 30 years, we might like be able to analyze society and rural society more in class terms rather than in to understand what has been the exploitation and oppression, both in gender and universal terms. So in a context of low-income countries where you have less of a visible movements and social and political activism, how accumulation can be explained in non-material terms. And I guess now I'll give Ece, Arun and Sanjari opportunity to reply both to their own comments and to the questions of the floor, of the audience, sorry. Maybe Arun wants to go first.
Sure. No, Lorena, if you want me to go first, there's a lot to unpack in the discussion we're having here. I've written a lot of notes. I think there's three things I want to hide. I want to bring out from our discussion so far. The first one is that I think Ece is completely right in the fact that we have to better understand gender as a macro concept shaping patterns of transformation. And I think a really instructive way, Ece, going forward would be to think about doing something comparative with China. Because the Chinese path since the mid-1990s has been one which has fundamentally undermined the rural patriarchal family, exploded it apart, if you like, in order to release women workers to move to urban areas to work in factories. And then child rearing has been left to those who are left behind, who tend to be the parents and the older members of the family. And then the difficulties that created then resulted in generations of children being herded off into boarding schools, rural boarding schools, because the care regime in the countryside couldn't cope. Now, I'm not an expert on this area at all, but I just find this fascinating because we've not, I think, seen an example of the extent to which that rural patriarchal family has been so fundamentally transformed by state action. And I do think that it would offer a useful counterpoint in thinking about the way in which gender shapes patterns of transformation. That's the first thing I would say in terms of these concepts. The second, in terms of the comments, the second thing, going back to Sanjari's comments on gendered networks, I think this is really interesting. And the policy point of it, I think, is really worth bringing out. You know, for all that we can be critical of or challenge or whatever, policy interventions by international organizations, it is the case that UN Women in particular, in country offices and regional offices in Eastern and Southern Africa, have tried to invest a lot of resources in rural areas in seeking to transform gender norms. And the way in which they try and do this is that they try and sit down with spouses and chart out a future path, a future life path with them. It's kind of like a therapy, if you like. In which people, especially men, come to realize that cooperation will get them a lot further than hierarchy. That cooperative behavior with their spouse in terms of shared goals and common goals will move them further along in terms of improving their livelihood than having control over women's labor. And I find these experiments quite interesting, but they're not generalized. They're not generalized because they're incredibly expensive, because you have to go and work in communities on, you know, one person acting with a family over a prolonged period of time. So they're not considered cost effective, but they're really interesting interventions, which I think could really, they're about reshaping gendered networks and reshaping the way in which the complexity of the familial mediation, Ece, that you talk about, the way in which that process of mediation is perhaps reconfigured. Okay, so I think that's also an interesting example. And then the final point on, you know, Ece, that you made, and then which Lorena has commented on, accumulation as a gendered concept. I think this is really important. I'm not sure what it means because I don't have the answer, but here's the thing. Processes of accumulation are based upon surplus labor, whether in pre-capitalism, surplus labor in the form of surplus value under capitalism, if you take a Marxist approach, but surplus labor. The thing about it is that surplus labor is a gendered concept, because within the family structure, within the household structure, I prefer household to family, within the household structure, men very often define what is surplus labor. And men's understanding of women's surplus labor may not equate to women's understanding of surplus labor. Surplus is gendered. And if surplus is gendered, accumulation is gendered. It has to be, right? So this is a very important way, I think, it seems to me, of moving forward and thinking about the way in which gender shapes patterns of transformation. And so I think, Ece, in saying this, it's very, very appropriate. I'll leave it at that. I'm talking too much. Lori.
Yeah, we are perfectly on time. So thank you, Arun, to clarify some of the points, and I think there is further venue, hopefully, for discussions. Sanjari, do you want to also?
I think we're taking up more time as discussants than Ece, but I will throw in I will throw in a couple of thoughts here, kind of following a little bit on what Harun said, but also maybe linking to the question that Anne was raising. Again, kind of sort of zooming back into the role of perpetuation of, you know, gender norms and the role of social networks in that kind of perpetuation. So, for example, there is very recent work that seems to speak to the kind of intervention that Harun was referring to, sort of, you know, creating a space for molding and differently shaping narratives about gender roles. So there is this, there is an NGO in sorry, all my examples are actually about India here, but there's a fantastic, you know, set of initiatives that an NGO called Breakthrough is running in India. And there's been a recent evaluation of this kind of an initiative, which kind of gets adolescents in school as part of their curriculum talking about gender roles and norms around sort of, gendered kind of work and responsibility and so on, in one of the most gender conservative parts of India, which is up in the northern part of the country, in Haryana. And what they are finding, so this was, I think, one of the earliest evaluations, but now this kind of policy in kind of collaboration between various state governments and the NGO sector is being sort of rolled out in different parts of the country. And it's very interesting, and obviously taking into account all the concerns that Harun raises about cost effectiveness and how does one embed this, in a scalable way. But the initial results seem to be very interesting in the sense that what they are finding in the Haryana context is that the beliefs of young boys, and we are talking about, adolescent girls and boys, right? So in secondary school, changing in an interesting way to become more gender progressive. I do use that term a little bit loosely here, with not much of impact on girls, because at some level you are expecting them to sort of, probably respond in a different way or within a different timeline compared to boys. But at some level, what is interesting is also the age. So I also want to shine the spotlight that if we are thinking about how to shape differently gender narratives and roles about gender norms and so on, maybe the age to do that would be to think about school-age children, where your thought process are still very much influenced by external stimuli and what you're learning and peer and so on. And maybe that links a little bit to what Anne was raising as well, in terms of reshaping how society perceives the relationship between the mother and the child versus the father and the child, right? And when we look at some of these popular ads about sharing the load and so on, all that is great, but at some level they're probably, along with various kinds of other policies and interventions that we are thinking of sort of moving ahead the agenda of gender equality, there is a role for thinking about the correct or the appropriate, not the correct, the appropriate age when some of these changes might be inculcated as part of school curriculum. Just like, as we think about how sex education is incorporated into school curriculum, they're similarly thinking about how we want to sort of incorporate and sort of normalize conversations about different discourses of gender roles and gender norms in areas, specifically those geographies that Ece refers to as probably being more susceptible to this kind of challenges, and how policy can sort of feed into that. My other small point was kind of following again a bit upon what Harun was mentioning about China. It is true that the Chinese development process has been such a juggernaut in a sense of really changing the landscape. But I also wanted to highlight the challenges that a lot of China scholars have emphasized about parents in, let's say, current generations, right? Facing double burdens, right? So in certain contexts, yes, maybe the children are being raised by those left behind, but in light of the one-child policy, and I know that that has now been sort of relaxed and so on, but for successive generations, it's almost like you not only have the care burden of your children, but also of your elderly parents, because there is only one of you, and it's not just your parents, but it's your partner's parents as well as two sets of families, kind of depending on this nuclear family. And there again, the gender distribution of care, right? So sort of trying to sort of point out another angle that might be interesting for Ece to consider in case you want to think about this comparatively. That's Dr. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Sanjari. We then leave the floor to Ece, but before doing that, we chip in with two further questions coming from the chat box. There is Nicola Yates, Professor of Social Policy, who wonders how applicable are your insights from Turkey to the Global South more generally. And Anne, again, I'm going to read it. So it seems to be that public social democratic patriarchy is the end goal, but that is still patriarchal. How would you relate this to the goal of attaining a socialist feminist society? Another question is about how to change public policy from thinking of children as private goods that family needs to care to, think of them as public goods that society needs to care for, the Nancy Forbes question. So lots of big questions, but
thank you so much.
Yeah.
I will try to be quick and answer these within 7 minutes. And what Hegelian Marxism does, what does it add? I think it's important. The biggest difference between Hegelian Marxism and the Althusserian understanding is accepting the significance of collective subject. Like rather than thinking that, oh, accumulation gives rights to capitalist or patriarchal or racist collective subject, Hegelian Marxism helps me to see actually collective subjects gains accumulation by acting collectively. So as well as that, I think the category of mediation is very important in Hegelian Marxism, and I think we don't have these understandings in what I call mechanical materialist understandings. And also control, when you think about in this way, control is not excluded. Control is part of how collective subject secures accumulation, when you think in the Hegelian Marxist way, I believe. And patriarchal bargaining with the family, I am a little bit cautious about the concept of bargain. I believe that we need to be careful about it. Yes, it acknowledges women's agency, but at the same time, as Cynthia Coburn mentioned in her critique to Denis Candioti in that time, it assumes that that both sides who are bargaining have equal access to power. And I don't think that this is the case for many households. And therefore, I am a bit hesitant and careful about using the concept of bargain. Sex-effective economy, I'm going to read more about it and hopefully learn more. My only concern that I'm sure we are careful about it, we shouldn't assume heterosexuality as a de facto ground in that economic like talking about sexuality of female peasants is very interesting. Like in my analysis, my fieldwork, I found different sexualities, different genders in villages, and they don't have another option other than getting married. And also, I like to add very briefly, I agree with Harun's discussions, and unfortunately we don't have time, but I just checked, we have a colleague, Hailai. Their work is on Ethiopia, and they closely follow Chinese political economy as well. And it would be a bit difficult to believe, but in Turkey, we also had the same model that I called Soviet model. And Turkish state used to follow this model, try to take women out of agriculture, pull them out of agriculture by providing education, safe accommodation, as well as guaranteed employment. Unfortunately, all these policies are interrupted by neoliberal understanding around 1980s. Quickly moving, I'm so sorry. In the book, as well as focusing on Turkey, I have provided a comparative analysis between Turkey and other countries in the global south. I choose some countries in South Asia, Middle East, North Africa, South Africa, and Latin America. And in my analysis, I found two different trajectories in terms of gender patterns. So therefore, my analysis of Turkey, to a certain extent, covers other countries in the global south as well. But of course, hopefully in future, I'm going to have some grant and I will explore more. If someone gives me money about it, it will be great. And that's all. I think I need to stop here, unfortunately. I'm so sorry that I couldn't address all the questions and discussion points.
Yeah, no, thank you, Ece. I mean, we are, still running out of time, but I hope this is the first of a series of discussion, and points raised obviously deserved more attention and development. Anne Ferguson also has a further comment about the concept of racial system of regime and the role of nationalism and ethnicism deserves more development and thinking. Yeah, we are living in a a time of contradiction and crisis. So it's yeah, this is hopefully it's just the first of a series of discussion, and hopefully we can organize a workshop on gender and social policy, as we have many people working on these topics here at the OU. But in the meantime, I thank you, Ece, Sanjari, Arun, for the great discussions, Heidi for the technical support, the audience, and Ferguson, those who raised very important questions. And I hope to see you soon. Please follow us on our newsletter and on Twitter. We have a Twitter account, intdev_OU, so you can get updates on our activities and seminars. And yes, I hope you have a wonderful rest of the morning for Arun, I guess, who is based in Canada. It's been very nice to join us today. And for everybody, our next seminar is on the 14th of October, so next month, and it will be on writing and research ethics, and I hope you will join. But further details will be added on the website, so please stay tuned. Thank you very much, everybody, and Ece, congratulations again. A round of applause, digital and not.
Thank you so much for your contribution.
And yeah, please order the book also for your library, so it can be also part of teaching material. Thank you very much again, and see you soon.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you, everyone. Congrats, Ece. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.